All right, everybody, welcome to Destination Unknown, episode number 25. I can't believe I made it to a quarter of a century of episodes here. My last episode, number 24, I was with Richard Copley, and we discussed Edgar Allan Poe, and you're never going to believe what we're going to discuss today. We are with Paul Lewis, and we're still in Massachusetts, and we're going to be discussing Edgar Allan Poe. Paul, if you don't mind, just introduce yourself, and then we're going to just get into it and see the ping pong of Edgar Allan Poe conversation.
Okay, well, thanks, Max. I'm a retired Boston College English professor. I taught American literature there and courses on literary Boston and Gothic fiction and Poe for about 45 years. I'm the author of a few books. A couple of them that are about humor, including Cracking Up American Humor in a Time of Conflict. That actually is pretty relevant to what's been happening in American politics and humor these days. I'm also the author of this crazy book that was translated into Japanese called A is for Asteroids, Z is for Zombies, a bedtime book about the coming apocalypse. I've worked on lots of sort of public humanities projects connected to literary Boston and Poe in Boston. I chaired a foundation that persuaded the city government to create a sort of square in downtown Boston dedicated to Poe, and then to install a statue of Poe in the square. So anyway, and I've done exhibitions about literary Boston, but I won't go on enough about me.
Well, well, we're going to be talking about you a lot, but you were at Boston College, definitely at the same time I was at Mount Ida College, right down the street from you.
Okay.
I was there in 88 to 92, graduated in 92. And so we may have run into some certain circles at some readings around Boston at the time.
Very possible.
I remember seeing Ginsberg. I remember seeing Kurt Vonnegut at Boston College.
Oh.
I want to say that was 1990, but it was in the cafeteria of all places.
I was probably on leave that semester. I think I would have gone. I would have been very interested in Vonnegut.
Yeah. Oh, as you can guess, it was a packed house. It was insane. As Vonnegut would always get an audience. So, you mentioned about the statue in Boston that you had a large contribution towards. Can you talk? Let's start there because this is a prime American literature and history that I want to get into, and so let's start on how that came to fruition and why that came to fruition.
Max, I have a flyer that I've made up which has images of the statue. Do you want to share my screen? Or
yeah. If you want to send them to me, I'm going to provide that in the editing process.
Okay. All right. Good.
We'll just throw them in.
Okay. Sounds good. So where to start? Back in 2008, I was teaching a course the fall of that year on Poe and the Gothic, kind of my standard course. And I noticed, and I started to talk about the fact that the Poe bicentennial was coming up and that Boston, of all the places Poe was associated with, was not going to do anything about it. And whereas cities like Richmond and Philadelphia and Baltimore, they were all about it. And after all, the connection to Poe, the primary one, is that what the bicentennial was about happened in Boston. That is, he was born in Boston on January 19th, 1809. So with the help of a graduate student who didn't like the idea that Boston wasn't going to do anything about it, I organized a celebration of the bicentennial at Boston College. It was wildly attended. It was a freezing cold night, but 200 people showed up. We had all sorts of talks and student skits about, imagine that Poe was a kind of a resident advisor in a BC dorm, and then it ended with reciting the Raven. We had a Poe-themed cake. Anyway, it got to be sort of fun. And in connection with that, I organized a small exhibit at BC's library about Poe in Boston. And then I proposed doing a larger version of it at the Boston Public Library. So, and the record of that, there's a kind of, there's a website for that exhibit. It's called The Raven in the Frog Pond, Edgar Allan Poe in the City of Boston. So that exhibit was very well attended, and one thing led to another. And another thing that next came up was creating a foundation. I didn't do the work of creating it, but I served as its chair throughout its run, that would advocate for Poe Boston memorials, and so on. One thing led to another. Eventually, the Poe statue was created, and I'd be happy to talk more about that.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting to me right off the bat is New England, Massachusetts, and then microscoping in the Boston is such a literary community. Why was there a hole for Poe's bicentennial? I mean, where was the gap in connecting bridges there?
Well, first of all, to the extent that people in Boston paid attention to Poe, and they did in the same way everyone does all around the world, that he's such a fascinating and delightful writer. Uh, but very few people knew he was born in Boston. He has a kind of Southern affiliation in most people's minds. People don't necessarily know that he lived in all these different places, including London, England, for 5 years as a child. Anyway, so there wasn't much concentration on it. And there was this old legacy of the kind of hostility between Poe and the Boston literati that got cooked up in the 1840s when he came here and he gave a disastrous lecture that Poe biographers have called the Boston Lyceum fiasco. So anyway, the kind of lingering stench that Poe was to the extent that he was a Bostonian writer, he was kind of the dark sheep of the group. And Boston is a much brighter, optimistic, utopian place where writers like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow were easier to celebrate.
And Thoreau, and yeah, I guess.
Oh, well, of course. Oh, yeah. Who Poe called the so-called poetry of the so-called transcendentalists. Poe called the Boston literati the Frog Pondians. So Poe has a really sharp wit, and he turned it against Boston in an effort to gin up publicity around the time the Raven was
He would
published.
have loved Instagram. He would have loved it.
Yes, he would have lived and died there because a lot of this publicity did not end up doing him good.
Well, for those that are unfamiliar, what was so horrendous about the lecture?
Well, okay, so this is a very tumultuous time in Poe's life. He publishes The Raven in late January of 1845. It gets an enormous amount of publicity, some good, some bad. He's already a very controversial figure in American literary circles. He's known as a very harsh book reviewer. They would call him the Tomahawk Man. But it boosts his standing. He gets invited to do public lectures in New York, and then this one in Boston, October 16th of 1845. So, well into the year after
and the eve of Halloween.
Yes, he's been spending a good deal of that year writing reviews and engaging with the Boston literati in pretty hostile ways. He's been writing especially negative reviews about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Boston's beloved poet, the Bard of Cambridge, right? So by the time he gets here, he's got a chip on his shoulder. The Boston audience has a chip on its shoulder. Everybody's ready to fight, and that's kind of what happens. He spends the first 15 minutes of his lecture. Well, first of all, he has to wait 2 hours until the first speaker, the recently returned ambassador to China, a guy named Caleb Cushing, does his oration. Then they introduce Poe. He's got from New York. He's just written The Raven. So he spends the first 15 minutes insulting the audience. He apologizes in really drippy terms for not being able to deliver the kind of poem that they wanted because he doesn't believe that such poems, didactic poems, are actually poems at all. So he's apologizing for the imbecility of the poem he's going to read. Then he was unable to write a new poem for the occasion. So instead, he reads a long poem that he'd written in his youth called Al Araf, pretends it's a new poem. Eventually, he recites The Raven. The crowd thins out. The response in the press over the next few days is incredibly negative.
And how at that moment in time, with The Raven being published, was it known at that point? Was it rising in popularity? Where was the standing of The Raven?
It couldn't have been higher. It couldn't have been more familiar everywhere in the country.
Right.
And that's within weeks of its publication. I mean, it's really extraordinary. If you think about the way in which literary works kind of get into the canon of American literature, how do they get to be famous? How do they endure, right? And generally speaking, there's a kind of period of time, but not with The Raven. The Raven is republished everywhere within a month of its
In
original
different
publication.
magazines across America and England.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Within the first year, there are parodies of it that are published in places very far apart. And America's a much smaller country in the
Right.
1840s, but still, eventually there'd be a parody in Ogaquo, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri. But anyway, so yes, it would be an understatement to say that people were paying attention to the poem, and in Boston in particular, because they had it in for Poe. And so one of the snarkiest, most critical parodies of the poem was published in Boston, kind of in the run-up to Poe's lecture. It was called The Turkey. And in it, the main character, the narrator of the poem, he's not up at night, kind of dreamily, mournfully thinking about his lost love. He's staggering out of a barroom, dead drunk, too poor to buy another drink, too drunk to find his way home in the dark, leaning back against a lamppost in confusion. And it turns out that this image of Poe is both a pauper, a drunkard, and
Mhm.
a violent man, because he ends up shooting at the turkey, which he hallucinates through delirium tremens is on his head.
Hmm. Is in his letters or in his biographies, how did he feel about these parodies? I mean, because in culture today, when you get parodies, it means you're doing something right or something popular.
Well, he didn't respond to all of them. In
Okay.
my Before I got into writing this book about the Poe parodies, uh, Poe scholars knew that there were 18, maybe 19 of them. I'm going to be talking about 29 because, with the help of friends, I found other ones. And so he didn't comment about all of them. He probably didn't know about all of them, but he did comment about a few of them. And if they were smart, soulful, had their own thing going, he noticed that. If they were just incredibly hostile, then he would say things like, "Who is this guy? I've never seen anything more stupid than that,"
Oh, how interesting.
in
Okay.
letters.
Yeah. That's so interesting that crowd, they were taking shots back then at
Oh
each
yeah.
other.
Oh yeah.
And what was as far as a reviewer goes, was he a negative reviewer for most works he was given to review? I mean, what was the story there?
Well, I mean, he was called the Tomahawk Man,
Right.
not because he was a gentle reviewer. He was incredibly thoughtful in his
Mhm.
reviews. He would offer almost anything that he reviewed. He would say positive things about it, but almost anything that he reviewed, he would then go on to say very negative things about it. He constantly accused writers, not just Longfellow, but many, of plagiarizing, sometimes from his own works. Um, and I mean, really, this is where Poe's sense of humor comes out the most clearly, I think, because he's just so darn snarky about it,
Right.
that he irritated a lot of people. Some of them, were waiting to get back at him.
Was there any part of his way of irritating people to bring about more attention to Poe and his work? What was it? Was it a showman?
Yes, I think he had, especially around the time The Raven came out. I think he, with a friend and co-editor
Mhm.
with him, Nathaniel Parker Willis, must have thought there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Right.
I think they were wrong. In fact, I think it's a great example of how there is such a thing as bad publicity for a
Mhm.
writer trying to make a reputation for himself. When Poe died, his obituaries kind of always mentioned the Raven and
Right.
always talked about how he was a genius, but also how he was a very flawed human being.
Mhm. Why is that? Because
What were his flaws?
yeah, yeah, even in high school, when you read Raven for the first time, you learn more about Edgar Allan Poe than you do anything else.
And by the way, I think people were constantly at the time sort of confusing him with characters in his works, especially
Mhm.
the character narrator of the Raven.
Right.
But because Poe also had experience of deep traumatic loss, but I think Poe was much more complicated than any one of his characters. Um, I think I lost the thread of what you just asked about
Well,
you.
there's probably no thread. We're just letting it go. But I mean, I want to get to the statue.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think I want to bridge our way there little by little. And I know that you're in the final stages of another book on Poe right now. If you can talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so it's called Quothing the Raven. The
Mhm.
first responses to America's most famous poem.
First
Um,
responses, okay?
the first responses, and there's a second subtitle, including 29 parodies of the Raven published during Poe's lifetime.
Yeah,
So
okay.
that's what it's about. And it starts with the idea of really concentrating on how the Raven took flight, right?
Hmm.
Poe famously wrote to a friend that he had written the Raven because he wanted it to have a run. He wanted it to get out there, to be read, to be remarked about, and that certainly happened. So the book does that, and it talks about how people were experiencing the Raven for the first time, hearing it read, encountering it, how Poe's standing in New York among the literati there really grew, how he became much more of a public figure, um, and then how this played out over the 4 years or so during between then and when he died. So then it becomes a story about these parodies that were written, and each parody appears in the book, and I write a headnote trying to explain it. These poems are extraordinarily different. They're not what you would necessarily assume. Well, some of them are what you would assume, literary parodies. Many of them are really strangely different. Like there are two advertisements in the form of the Raven. One
Wow,
is
okay.
for a clothing store, a discount clothing store in Manhattan. The other is for Gerard's medicated Italian soap.
But that just shows you how big the Raven was. When you have capitalism now coming in and stealing your art
Yeah,
for advertising, you've hit it.
yeah,
And
I think that's
and
right.
right, and so was this a first? Was this what were other writers of the day getting this type of attention and having businesses parody their work?
Well, the idea of parody was pretty broad in the 1840s. That is, almost any funny poem could be called a parody. But
Okay.
works that were actually parodying other works, yeah, it was quite common. You can find other writers, Longfellow, Whittier,
Mhm.
um, whose work is being parodied. Nothing on this scale, I believe,
Right.
uh, at this point, because The Raven is so much more a public work, and because it's so memorable, it's so imitatable, right? It's in fact, it's hard to get it out of your mind. It's kind of a colossal collection of earworms.
Mhm.
So, um, yes, I was going to talk a little bit about other kinds of parodies
Yeah.
that are out there, right? And there are ones that are essentially political op-ed pieces about things like tariff policy, or about what should be done with a art museum in Lower Manhattan, or what it's like to visit the Chinese Ethnographic Museum in Boston, or how places are infested with bed bugs, or what to do with Irish immigration, or the rise of prize fighting in America. I mean, these are extraordinary cultural time machines that bring us to strange places and have a point of view about Poe, maybe, but certainly about lots of other things.
That's so wildly interesting. I mean, I never knew that about the businesses paired. I mean, that's just it sort of puts a new stamp on how big Poe was back then too, because
Without being able to make any money from it, by the way. I
right,
mean, I mean, Poe had a real talent for not making money. And other writers did too. It was hard to make money as a writer at that
right.
time.
Well, yeah, and that actually brings me back to the first publication of the Raven, because other magazines were publishing it and republishing it. How did that copyright stand so rigid, or it didn't?
There was no protection. Once you published work in an American magazine or newspaper, anybody could reprint it without paying you a dime or without paying the magazine a dime. So Poe, as far as I know, he got paid once, and then he was kind of paid in the sense that he was invited to do public lectures. But even then, you know,
Right. So, I mean, I don't want to pick on a specific magazine, but so the American Mercury could have republished The Raven and not pay Poe anything.
Absolutely. And dozens of magazines and newspapers did that. There was a lot of poetry in newspapers at that time. In
Mhm.
fact,
Oh,
the
yeah.
difference between a newspaper and a magazine in the first part of the 19th century in the US is sometimes hard to detect.
Yeah, well, there was a lot more literature back then and a lot more literature being shared every day. Yeah. Before
Right.
there was TV.
And also because before poetry in any way became lucrative and it became worthwhile to have a brand, right?
Right.
Poe is among the first generation of writers really who wanted to establish a brand. Otherwise, earlier, a lot of anonymous and pseudonymous publication because that was kind of the cultural norm.
Hmm. And I don't know if you have an exact number, but how many times do you think The Raven was published in its first couple years? I mean,
Oh,
are we talking hundreds?
I mean, I haven't done that search, but I've searched only in the first month, and I think it was something like 25 or 30 in the first month.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
so I assume that that just carried on. I
Wow.
mean, in the preface of the book, I talk about how today the Raven is ubiquitous, and I talk about how, I've done, say, a search on Amazon.com for the words Raven and Poe, and I've come up with this insane array of products, but also over 1,000 of them, separate listings, and it's just crazy stuff, everything from throw pillows, to little I don't know what you call them, wear around your neck, and you contain some ashes from a funeral urn, and wear that, or a little vial that pretends to be for poison,
Right.
but then things that are wildly inappropriate, like cell phone holders and
Right. Or a little capsule of your lover's blood.
oh yes,
Yeah.
that's especially yes, of course. Who wouldn't want that?
All right. So let's get into let's get into your work with the statue. This is very important. Um, Take us from the beginning, the seed of the idea, and I also want to get into the speed bumps along the way because none of this is ever easy. I know it's never easy. So,
We were lucky. The mayor of Boston at the time, Thomas Menino,
mhm.
really liked Poe. He was not a Frog Pondian in any traditional sense, and he supported the project. And once you have that level of support, then other city institutions were very helpful. Nevertheless, at the start, the first thing we did was get this square dedicated, and Tom Menino came and was there at the dedication of Edgar Allan Poe Square. For those who want to find it, it's at the intersection of Boylston Street and Charles Street South, right across from the Boston Common. So that was
And
dedicated.
let me just say this for those who don't know: the Boston Common is the park in the center of the city of Boston, and that's that. So that's it's right near the park. Yeah.
Right. We couldn't put it on Boston Common because there was a rule that said you couldn't put another statue on the Common. They waived that rule for the Martin Luther King statue, but
Okay.
for us, no. Poe had to go nearby. It's fine. Um, so, as I said, I wasn't the person who organized the foundation, but I was in it from the start. And at some point, about 2/3 of the way through, I took over running it on a day-to-day basis. The city of Boston has a 7-step plan for how you can try to install public art. Each of those steps has many sub-steps, right? And all of it, although very bureaucratic, makes a great deal of sense because you shouldn't be able to just plunk down a statue in the middle of a major American city.
Not in 2025, anyways.
No, and not in 2010 when we started to do this. Anyway, everybody loves Poe, despite all the bad feelings back in the 1840s. And everybody loves Poe here. So there was a lot of enthusiasm for it. There's a foundation called the Brown Fund that is dedicated to supporting public improvements in the cityscape of Boston.
Okay.
They gave us a $15,000 planning grant. And from that point on, we just moved through the steps. And there were very few major bumps along the way. We had to raise about $250,000, and that turned out to be effortful, but easier than, we could do it in about 3 years. We had to find an artist to do it, and the city plan tells you how to go about it. You put out a call for proposals. We got a lot of proposals back. We
Hmm.
chose 3, and then you put it out for public comment, and lots of people commented, and we chose. Go on.
When you say public comment, please describe that.
Well, there's a process where the foundation makes an announcement, the city art council promotes it, word gets out, hundreds and hundreds of people write in and
Okay.
comment on the 3 final proposals. And then it happens that we chose the one that was overwhelmingly preferred by commenters. The statue that we chose was by a brilliant sculptor, a professor of philosophy as her day job, but Stephanie Rocknack. She teaches at Hartwick College. And the sculpture that she designed is, as I said, an installation. It has Poe walking across this square that's dedicated to him, and he's walking towards the likely birthplace, which would have been at around 62 Charles Street South. Then it would have been Carver Street in
Hmm.
Boston, about 2 blocks away from the square. So he's walking there, and he's in mid stride, and his left hand is back pointed towards the frog pond across the street, and he in a very dismissive way. And the idea of the installation is that he's come on a train that would have arrived at the other side of the street, and
Hmm.
he's walked into the square. And as he's walked into the square, his suitcase has kind of come half open. So pages are falling out of his suitcase and they're landing in the square. And you can see them. There are 6 of them. And they get closer and closer to the statue. The statue, in addition to have Poe walking across the square with his left hand back, has a raven coming out of the front end of the suitcase. So it's delightfully animated, kinetic statue. And behind the suitcase, there's a pile of fallen papers, and there's a telltale heart, an anatomically correct heart. So it evokes many, many things about Poe's connection to Boston, and it's called Poe Returning to Boston. And it's meant to show him returning to Boston triumphantly
Hmm.
after all the trouble he got into here and all the disapproval he encountered.
And what is his approximate age at that statue?
Well,
Being
so
that statue.
yeah. His face is taken from late daguerreotypes. So I'd say, his late 30s. He doesn't really get into his 40s.
Hmm. Wow. And is in your work now, with what you're digging into now and finalizing this latest book,
Yeah.
is there anything new that you've uncovered that's been jaw-dropping?
Well, just the range of these parodies is, I think, is really interesting. Folk scholars
Mhm.
have known about the parodies or some of them, but not a lot has been written about them.
Yeah.
One here, one there. But when you take them as a group, they're just wildly different and wildly in connection with all of these things you wouldn't have guessed getting into it. I'll give you some examples.
Mhm, yes,
So
please.
there was one of them was published in the Yale Literary Magazine. So it's an undergraduate magazine,
Mhm.
and it refers to South Middle. So South Middle was the oldest dormitory at Yale. So then you're in that dormitory and you're thinking about this poem, um, or I'm just trying to think. There's definitely one about tariff policy at this time, called Protection's Ghost, and it's someone who's just horrified by the idea that we're taking down tariffs, which is something that happened. Um, anyway, so they move in these very, very different directions. And I think it becomes a sort of American studies project to follow the breadcrumbs out into what was going on in the culture.
And then for all of my ephemera listeners, talk to me about digging for this stuff. You said 29. There may be more out there. We don't know.
I think
But
it's likely.
yeah, what is it like digging for this stuff, and what is your process of that?
Well, I should just say that since I'm confining myself to within those first few years,
Mhm.
clearly there are many, many, many more adaptations and parodies
Yeah,
and everything else of the Raven once you get beyond that, right? Just like,
right.
Um, well, it's nothing very unusual. There are databases. American Periodicals is one database. America's Historical Newspapers is another. Newspapers.com is a third. You can search for keywords in it. Nevermore, quoth, anything with
Okay,
quoth
right.
in it is
Yeah,
pretty. Well, lots of other phrases, and you just keep doing that. As I said, at a certain point, I just wanted to start writing about them. I
right.
thought I had enough, but you're right. I'm sure that there are ones that I didn't find, and that other people who've, looked for it found. I'm sure there's more waiting to be found, which is
Right.
great.
But now this all starts with a keyword search on a website. But are you then going into the microfilm and seeing what that looked like? I mean, I know.
No, no, thank goodness. I know I talked to my students about kind of access to information, what it was
Yeah,
like back when I was in high school to have to find a movie review of some
yeah,
movie that came out, like 10 years before,
sure.
and what a project that was, how it might take a whole afternoon. And you
Oh,
get one.
afternoon, or writing a request from your local library to another library in 3,000 miles away because they have a copy of something they're going to send you a copy of. I mean,
Yeah. So the good news about these databases that I mentioned is that they link to documents that they cite. So once you find something that you think might be a parody of the Raven, you can click on it and read it, download it, and then work
and
with it.
wow. So each time you did that, was it a momentary pause of celebration that you sit back and you
Sure.
I got another.
Sure. And I should say Richard Copley helped me as well. He
Oh,
found a
okay.
couple, and so we celebrated together. Uh,
Yeah, that's great.
yeah, yeah, yeah. He was into it for a little while.
And did you put the word out to your to your peers that what you were doing and if they knew of anything?
That would have been a good thing to do, but I
Right.
didn't. I
And
could have
okay,
I could have posted that. I don't know, I was kind of protective of the project.
yeah.
But yeah, that probably would have come up with things.
And okay, so my last question about this part of it is once you do the research on this and once you discover something new, or new for this book, did you ever try to have original copies of that magazine? Did you ever try to find original copies of that magazine so you could see it like that?
I wouldn't mind, but that's a whole different kind of
Right.
project. It's an acquisitive bibliophile impulse. Richard's certainly into that.
Yes.
I'm into decluttering, so no, no, I have not tried to do that. In the case, one interesting case, the poem I mentioned, The Turkey, right?
Hmm.
The Bostonian parody of the Raven, that, the original copy, it was republished once, but in the original version, it's illustrated. Um, and that was lost. And people did not know. And I found it, the Boston Public Library didn't know they had it. And I found it there, and then we were able to see it. And the illustrations are particularly insulting to Poe.
Okay, but that's too vague, Paul. You found it. Give me that story. Give me that story of how you found it.
So I was looking around for it in the Boston Public Library online,
Uh-huh.
right? And it wasn't included, search for the turkey, no. But somehow in searching around on their website, I found a reference to someone who in the 1920s had mentioned having the turkey and somehow getting it to the BPL. I'm not even sure how I came
Okay.
across it. And so I contacted the librarians I know there, and it had been put down with their newspaper archive,
Hmm.
like on the second floor instead of in their rare books archive. But once they were aware that they owned this thing, they were like, "Wow!" And so
Yeah.
was I. That was probably the greatest eureka moment in this work, and it got me thinking about these parodies more.
You know, Richard would love to have all 29 copies of these.
Yes, he would.
That would make a great gift for him.
Yeah, but it would take a lifetime and a lot of money to get it.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. All right, so where does it stand now? The statue was finally erected. The statue was finally erected. Um,
in October of 2014. So that's a
2000,
pretty short
yeah,
time, for a project like that.
right. And so it's been around a decade now. The-
People love it. They loved it from the first. I mean, like the first, I do this walking tour of Post Boston that starts at the statue and ends up in a graveyard, appropriately enough. Um, and every time I'm down there, whether it's for that reason or just because I'm in downtown Boston, there are people there loving the statue. Kids like to take the same position, this kind of walking position, photograph. It's endlessly photographed. It's like it's just an adored landmark
yeah.
for people who love Poe.
I'm sure if I did a hashtag post statue Boston, I'm sure that there'd be thousands of images on Instagram with people
I,
taking pictures
I
of
think
the,
you're right.
yeah. And when you say that the tour that you do ends at a cemetery, um, is that the cemetery that oh, who's the I'm thinking of the female poet who's buried near the common.
I know of a male poet who is
Yeah.
buried on the common.
Oh, okay. Is that where the tour ends?
No, that's very close to the statue. It's actually right across the street from the statue at that end of the common, in the common burying ground. And the poet's name was Charles Sprague. He was known as the banker poet of Boston
Mhm.
at this time. And he was very well known, at some point, more well known than Poe. And Poe had snarky things to say about him, as you can be assured.
Yeah. Wow.
No,
Interesting.
the graveyard that we end up in is the King's Chapel burying ground, which is where the Puritans were buried. People like John Winthrop. It's a fabulous old burial ground, and it's in theory, it's where Hawthorne's Hester Prynne and Arthur Dimmesdale were buried. They're fictional characters.
How often are you doing that tour?
I did it a lot to raise money for the statue.
Oh, okay.
Now
Thank
I do it when the American Literature Association conference comes to town, and I do
Mhm.
it for school groups now and then. I'd like to find a way to do it in a more commercial way and promote it, but I'm just not much of an entrepreneur.
You got the Poe gene. You can't make money from your work.
Exactly, exactly.
And are you still teaching at Boston College or you retired fully now?
I'm fully retired. I have
Okay.
been for about a year and a half.
And so now your days you're just you're writing, you're researching and
Yeah, playing pickleball,
oh, okay. Okay.
exercising, try
You're
to keep
staying
ahead of the years.
you're staying busy.
Yeah.
And do you have a work in mind after the one you're just finishing up now?
Oh,
Are
that's
we staying with Poe?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think so. I've written a lot of shorter journalistic pieces over the years for newspapers.
Mhm.
I'd like to do more of that. It's hard to tell where the culture is moving these days, but nowhere good, I think. So it's a little hard to see what use I could make of what energy I have left for writing.
You got to play more pickleball.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Now, I can't have you here without talking a little bit about the book behind you, of course. Although that's you said that's the Japanese version.
Yeah,
Do you have an American version by your
hold
side?
on.
Yep,
Yes,
yep. We got to talk about that.
this is
People
my
know.
effort at kind of a
Yeah, there we
Poe-ish.
go. A is
Yeah,
for asteroids and Z is for zombies. A bedtime book about the coming apocalypse. Yeah, I think we're going to sell you some copies here.
that'd be great.
Talk to us about this great story.
Well, I don't know, at a certain point, a number of years ago, 10 years ago, I started to, I have a pretty dark imagination. Um, and it's one of the things that's drawn me to Gothic fiction and to Poe. I think in the conflict between Poe and the Bostonians, it's really a conflict between kind of a Gothic worldview and a utopian worldview. Though these Bostonians were constantly trying to reform the world, make it a better place, I'm all for it, but the world doesn't necessarily look like it's headed to a better place to me.
Right.
And I started to think I could I could imagine a different doom scenario for every letter of the alphabet. And I'm a fan of Edward Gorey's,
Oh,
right?
yes. Yes.
Um, so so I started to do that. And it turned out, kind of going on bike rides and thinking A is for this, B is for that. And it actually turned out to be pretty easy to do it. Um, so I wrote it out. I worked on it for a while. I found an agent who was interested in selling it. Together, we found an artist who was interested in illustrating it, and then we found a publisher, or we may have found the publisher and then found the artist. I don't remember. Anyway,
I'm gonna put a link to the video about it in here too as well.
fun. Yeah,
Yeah.
and Ken Lamach, the illustrator, created that video. I wrote the text, but he definitely worked on it. It's beautiful. But so anyway, yeah, I mean, I wrote a different ending for it. It has a spoiler alert. It has a very dark ending. Like instead of sort of saying, "Oh, come on, don't worry about that stuff," it's more like the ending of a horror movie where the villain is killed and then the hero turns his back and the villain rises back up. So it's a little bit like that.
But
Uh,
most great books, kids books, have a dark ending. There's a darkness towards the end and at the ending.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I hadn't
Yeah.
thought of that.
What was the most difficult letter for you to find?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, you might think it'd be something like V, but V was for virus,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. What did I mean, I'd actually have to go back and refresh my memory. It's been a long time since I've read this.
There's only 26 now, so I mean,
Yeah, Z was easy. I found plenty for that. Well, X for extinction. As more species die, humans will follow. There's no time to cry.
yeah. Oh, and it actually has a little bit of a gory, Edward Gorey look to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that was our influence. W for weather, so that was no
Okay.
problem. See what we got going on here. V is for viruses, now
Mhm.
unrestrained, melting your organs, digesting your brain.
This is great. This is great, Paul.
It's a cheerful book.
Yeah.
U, so that was a little tricky, right? So I said U is for urban landscapes on fire, crumbling skyscrapers, funeral pyres.
You were reaching. Yeah, there you go. You answered the question. You was
Good.
that's so funny. All right, I have two more questions for you. Then
Okay.
we'll let you off the hook.
Okay.
Um, a long forgotten must read Gothic writer that we've forgotten about.
Oh my goodness. I don't know.
I come with the questions, Paul. I come with the penetrating questions here.
It's all right with me. You know, I don't think forgotten among scholars, right? Because
Okay.
scholarship in the last 30, 40 years has been all about digging writers and finding new works
Mhm.
out of obscurity. A writer that I don't think is much read by the general public, an early one, is Charles Brockden Brown, Philadelphia novelist. And
Okay.
I would especially recommend Wieland or The Transformation, written about 1800.
These are
And
novels. These are novels.
yes, this
Okay.
is a novel based on an actual case of murder in Tomhannock, New York, where a husband and father killed his family because God told them to do it.
Hmm.
God's been up to a lot of this sort of stuff
Yeah.
in Gothic fiction. Um, anyway, so it's really interesting and it's very interior novel. It's told by the sister of the murderer who lived through the experience of this going on all around her.
And
So it's
is she narrating the story or is it told in epistolary letter form?
It is a long letter form,
Ah,
and then it's interrupted by a a courtroom narrative where the actual murderer tells the story of his crime. So it has a lot of sort of narrative moves that are interestingly subjective.
yeah.
The point I'm getting to here is that Charles Brockden Brown is a writer Poe knew, would have
Mm,
influenced Poe, was earlier than Poe. And the other novel of his that I'd recommend is called Ormond or the Secret Witness, which
okay.
is full of kind of political intrigue and strange dominating men and defiant women and transgendered character. And it's just an exciting revolutionary novel.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
I think our viewership's going to enjoy that. Okay, so this brings me to my famous last question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, our show is called Destination Unknown. You are episode 25. I've been all around the country. Um, I never know where I'm going. I let that be with the person I'm speaking to tell me where I'm going. So where is episode 26?
Well, I think you'll enjoy this, Max. It's out in New York State,
Okay.
Hartwood College. Stephanie Rocknack, who is the sculptor who created the Poe statue and also a philosopher, a philosophy professor, an expert on 18th century English philosophy, especially Hume, I believe. And I think she'll have a fascinating perspective because, in addition to having done the Poe statue, and by the way, it was delightful to work with her in the stages of the creation of the
Oh
statue.
yeah, we're gonna get into
Foundry,
that. Yeah.
seeing it go from a wood maquette to this giant styrofoam thing and then a wax. Anyway, fascinating. But she was just awarded the commission to do a statue in honor of Herman Melville at the Whaling Museum in New Bedford. And so she'll be able to talk to you about that. You know, for an artist who does literary projects, you could not do better.
Well, my literature lover in me thanks you for all of this. I had a great time speaking with you. I mean, I feel like we could go a couple more hours here, but I'm going to let you off the hook. I'm going to put in all the links for you as well. And when the video comes out in a week or two, please make sure you do watch the video. People will be asking questions to you as well.
Okay, thanks a lot, Max. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Paul. Bye-bye.